Hisham gets set up. Hisham will be presenting on theology for the 21st century, lessons from teaching Islamic theology to STEM university students. Our presenter's name is Hisham Jafar Ali, and is from Roots Academy in the UK. Hisham, we are going to ask for you to present for 20 to 25 minutes, ideally 20, which will leave us 5 to 10 minutes for a discussion with questions. And again, for those of you who may have missed previous sessions, please do try to put your questions in the chat throughout the presentation. And when Hisham finishes presenting, we will read out some of those questions and inshallah engage in a discussion. Hisham, over to you.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Thank for your time. It will be 20 minutes, not more, inshallah. So first of all, thank you everybody for joining. As the title says, it is what it says on the tin. So I'll hopefully be taking you through a little bit of context and then the pedagogical approach taken to teaching university students, particularly in STEM disciplines, and how we've kind of tried to marry theology and science, the empirical sciences. So let me give you a little bit of context first. So the problem that the organization I work with, Roots Academy, the problem we try to solve. There's about 130,000 Muslim university students in the UK, many of whom question their beliefs in God, don't practice Islam, or have never really connected to their faith. Pew polls tell us it's 1 in 4 in the US. Through anecdotal reference, really, in the UK, I'd probably say it's 1 in 6 or 1 in 7. But it's a concerning statistic. That means there's 30,000 of those students who virtually don't identify themselves as Muslims. And the root cause of that, in many cases, is that not having the foundational knowledge, or not having the foundational certainty in Islam as a worldview in the first place. So what we try to provide at Roots Academy is a contemporary, transformative and engaging education, a structured education to these university students. We provide a structured program called the Essentials, which consists of 5 courses. Each of these courses lasts 1 semester long, and they're covered in the form of weekly classes. We have, Alhamdulillah, we developed this curriculum in-house, completely from scratch, and kind of try and provide students this kind of structured education on campuses across the UK. Alhamdulillah, at the moment, we currently deliver these courses at 16 university campuses across the UK, and that number is rapidly growing. We'll be on 23 campuses by September. But so the idea is to deliver something that's structured, that's relevant to them, and that's transformative, but it covers the basics. And especially with the growing climate, what students are exposed to at university, there's more and more of an onus on us to develop this provision further and to ensure that it's relevant to their needs. On to the course that I'm referring to, and the one we'll be taking a bit of a closer look at. So one of the questions, every course that we develop within Roots, we ask the question, how should this subject matter be taught in the 21st century? How should it be taught to these very university students, this crowd, this audience? When we look at Iman, or the subject of theology or Aqidah, the approach that we've taken is over the course of 10 weeks, 9 to 10 weeks, we've tried to go through what we call the pillars of Iman, or the Arkanul Iman, the fundamental tenets that every Muslim should hold as true, should be certain in. But we focus in each of those tenets, we focused on trumping or pushing and developing their ability to think rationally about those tenets and being able to defend those tenets in a world where they are under attack through foreign ideologies. They're constantly exposed to secular, positivist ideas at university. And so the ability not just to know, not just to be certain, but to articulate this theology from a rational perspective. So after this, the 7 lessons where we cover the pillars of Iman, we have a number of lessons towards the end that focus on the contextual and the applied. There's a common thread that I'm going to come to in a second. But what we try to do is we try to focus on how can you apply everything you've learned to what you're about to go back and learn and you're about to engage in university. We have over 75% of our university students study the STEM sciences. That's medicine, biotechnology, engineering, economics, finance, etc. And so on a day-to-day basis, they come across truth claims that seem to oppose what what Islam or what Revelation says, or Revelation claims. And so how do they deal with those competing truth claims? How do they deal with that how do they deal with that confusion, that skepticism that they come across? That's what we try and cover in the last 2 to 3 contextual sessions when we teach these university students how to deal with doubts, etc. The pedagogical approach is what I'll talk about first before going deeper into the actual content and how that's relevant perhaps to all of yourselves. In terms of the pedagogical approach, I think that's equally important to what's being taught and the content, the substance being taught. What we try to do is we try to have every lesson divided into 3 components. There's a learning element, there's the reflection and discussion element, and there's the action element. So it's not purely an information overload. A third of every lesson, let's say the lesson is an hour and a half, at least half an hour in the lesson to 40 minutes has to involve discussions, group activities, interaction. And then the last part of the lesson has to end with a build up towards an action point, a specific discrete action point that the students can take away and actually act on. This kind of follows what we believe to be the prophetic model of education, which is that education is not just a knowledge dump, it's not just a piece of information, but it's actually engaging the minds. Looking at the cognitive development from a psychological perspective of these university students, they're at a stage where they can do more of the cognitive work. So rather than the teacher having to spoon feed them the information, the idea is the instructor loads them with questions, discussions, opportunities for reflection. And so to let them come to the conclusions themselves and facilitate that thinking and that engagement, that higher order engagement. If you look at the Bloom's taxonomy hierarchy, that high level engagement of analysis, evaluation, etc. It tends to be the case that when Islam is taught, whether it's to adults or children, it's always taught as though they're children. It's always taught in a very, it's almost dictated to them. They're not given the impression that they can have a think about the matter, that they can engage cognitively, intellectually. So that's what we try and do. We pepper the lesson with what we call reflection prompts, and that spurs discussion and group activity. And then the lesson ends with the action. So that's one part of the pedagogical approach. The other is, and when we define our learning outcomes, we try to use Fink's taxonomy of significant learning as opposed to Bloom's taxonomy being very kind of intellectual or cognitively taxing in its approach, whereas Fink incorporates the human dimension, the experiential dimension, which is very important when teaching things like Iman, things like theology. There is an experiential dimension. Iman is not just an intellectual construct. It's not just a logical argument. There's an experiential, spiritual dimension to it. And so we try to incorporate that into our learning outcomes. The third element in terms of the pedagogical approach we take is what I'd like to call pedagogical staircasing. So, there's this, the most important thread that I'd like to emphasize here in this forum is that for students of the empirical sciences who are also studying Islamic theology or trying to understand their Iman, we have to realize we're dealing with students who are ultimately sitting in a battlefield of ideas, of competing ideas, competing truth claims. And what we need to do is give them some way to arbitrate between those truth claims. That's the term I'm going to use. It's this kind of epistemic arbitration. How do you reconcile these competing truth claims? And so the thread that's common across the course, yes, we're teaching them about angels and about the Day of Judgment, etc., but the core focus of the course is actually to give them a foundation in epistemology. So lessons 1 to 3 introduces the idea of sources of truth. How do you know a thing to be true? What are the ways in which you know something to be true? Lessons 4 to 6, we try and delve much deeper into the epistemology of testimony, because revelation ultimately is a form of testimony. And in the ideological battleground we live in today, testimony is under attack. The empirical sciences, the sensory truth is the ultimate truth, and every other truth is a fairy tale. So we spend a few lessons breaking down that positivist approach and trumping and really pushing the idea that actually most of what we know is through testimony and verified testimony. How can testimony be verified? And why revelation is a source of testimony? Why do we believe in the unseen? Why do you believe in something you don't see? Why do you believe it? Why are you certain it's true? Well, it's because of as verified testimony. As we come into lessons 7 to 9, we start introducing science and the philosophy of science and the limitations of scientific inquiry. And how much weight to give a scientific truth claim? in this grand scheme of this epistemic battlefield. And then towards the last lesson, we actually give them case studies and we ask them to solve these case studies, whether it's the height of Adam alayhi salam, whether it's the sun setting in a murky pond. We give them actual verses of the Quran and ahadith that seem to apparently contradict something they've learned in the empirical sciences. And we ask them, you've been given the epistemic tools, you've been given examples of how you can reconcile these competing sources. What would you come up with? And then we kind of give them the mark scheme. Well, this is what Muslim scholars have done when it comes to these seemingly competing sources of information. So we staircase, their approach to that topic. So by the end, there's this kind of fading teacher support. So there's, reduce, as they call in educational theory, scaffolding. We reduce the scaffolding. So, in lessons 1 to 3, it's all teacher. And by lessons 9 to 10, it's as independent as possible. Coming to the actual content, what we try to do is take what's present in classical theological sources, such as Ibn Taymiyyah's Dar al-Ta'arud and Imam al-Ghazali's books, such as Iqtisad fil-I'tiqad. We try to introduce, in very simple language, without using the word epistemology, we try to introduce to them what is an epistemic source. So for instance, here's a sample slide where we're trying to introduce them the famous tripartite categorization of sources of information, sources of truth, the qat'i, dhanni, wahmi, the idea that there are certain truths, there are probable truths, there are improbable truths. And what we try to do is get them to understand this on a general level rather than giving religious examples. So it's very unlikely to be true that aliens exist, but I can't rule out the possibility. It's very unlikely to be true that the earth is flat, but I can't rule out. So that's something, it's dhanni, that's something wahmi, it's unlikely to be true, but we don't use the Arabic terms, we don't use the philosophical terms, we use layman speak. Similarly, probable truths, similarly certain truths. So we try to go deeper into what is a certain truth, where do certain truths come from, the idea of the qat'i, the idea of logical axioms such as causation, such as the part is less than the whole. And then we demonstrate, when we teach them the pillars of Iman, we start demonstrating the usage of these sources of knowledge. For example, the idea of using the logical axioms to conclude that God exists. So we apply, we demonstrate, we get them to articulate, to evaluate, etc. So that's one example. Another example is one of the group activities we give them. So there's every 10 minutes in the lesson, there's an activity, there's a reflection prompt for them to go away for 10 to 15 minutes. And one of them is this, take each source of knowledge, each source of truth that we've introduced, and think about things that you know solely through that source and not through any others. And what would make you more certain, and what would kind of limit you from being certain of something coming from that source. So start to get them to think, how do I know what I know? Where is it coming from? Getting them to think epistemically. And this is kind of in the first 3 lessons. And then we start introducing and going deeper into each of these, into testimony, revelation as a form of testimony. Towards the last few lessons in the course, we start looking at what I like to call epistemic arbitration. What is arbitration? It's the idea of mediation, right? You have 2 conflicting parties, and the arbitrator, the mediator, is sitting in the middle and saying, hey guys, let's find a middle ground. And that's really what this person is doing. This university student has one source of truth from their physics lecturer who's telling them that the Higgs boson is the God particle. They have another source of truth, from Revelation, which is telling them something different. And what we try to get them to do is to start dissecting. Okay, I know this. How do I know this? Well, through the testimony of my physics lecturer. Well, what epistemic value do I give to that? How much weight? Is that certainly true? Is that possibly true? Is that unlikely to be true? Are there any limitations? Are there any evidences for me to doubt its truth, reduce my level of certainty in it? Okay, I have another source of truth, is revelation. How much epistemic value do I give to revelation? Well, 100% certainty. Well, then, so giving them the tools to start arbitrating between this source of truth and wrestling with these hard questions. Before they come to the class, what they tend to do is just assume that revelation, science, reason are just poles apart. And what comes from revelation involves blind faith. What comes from science involves study, experimentation, validation, reasoning. And what we try to show them is actually all of these sources are complementary. You are the arbiter. The mind is the arbiter between these epistemic sources. And so we try to give them this very simplistic framework, which was used by prior scholars. We give them examples and case studies from the Quran, from the Sunnah, from prior scholarship, where you have essentially 3 options. Option 1 is you accept one truth claim, you outrightly reject the other. It's false. Option 2, you accept both of them, but you reconcile them through interpretation. And option 3, you stop and you say, only Allah knows what these both, how these both come together. I don't have the conclusion. This idea of tawaqquf, this idea of intellectual humility, intellectual submission. But at the same time, that last stop there prevents them from what we see quite often at universities, which is this kind of really, this mass, I don't want to say irtidad, but this sensation of people just leaving because they're not convinced anymore. And science doesn't seem to agree. I mean, religion doesn't seem to agree with science. So just throw the whole lot of religion in the bin. Well, there is an option, and the option is to intellectually submit and to hold on to reserve judgment. So that's the third kind of, so we train them on this framework. We give them dozens and dozens of examples, and then we throw verses and a hadith at them and we say, this is the verse, this is what physics says. How do you reconcile the two? What do you think? Let them do the brainwork. And the idea is that when they then go back to their anatomy lectures, they go back to their biomedical science, their engineering lectures, they go back to their lectures on thermodynamics, they don't sit there thinking this is something which has nothing to do with my ideology. What they're actually doing is they're trying to integrate the competing truth claims. This is really what it's about. How do you synthesize? How do you integrate these competing truth claims? And that's what we try and get them to understand over the course of this theology course, is give them the epistemic foundations to negotiate and integrate the various competing truth claims that they are exposed to at university, whether it's from the social sciences, the empirical sciences, or from revelation itself. But ultimately, what we want them to go away with is this understanding that, everything else, everything in the world, every empirical truth source, every scientific truth claim, every sociological, social science could have some level of dhann. It could have, in a sense, it has some level of speculation involved, some jump involved. Whereas what God informs us of is certain, at least from the perspective of its truth. What remains is the interpretation. How do we reconcile from an interpretive perspective? And what are your limitations as a layperson in that interpretive dialogue and in that interpretive process? But at the very least, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. All of this can be integrated, and there's a process for it to be integrated. And that's how we try to approach, that's how we try and approach teaching theology to a very different audience with a slightly different pedagogical approach, trying to teach them and really teach them epistemology using layman terms, so they can go back to the university lectures, go back to the world of the empirical sciences, confident in what they're learning. What are the results? So far, we've taught this course to over 2,000 university students in the last 3 years across the UK, across 16 university campuses. 95% of the students that come out of the course are more confident in understanding scientific phenomena from the lens of revelation. 83% of them are actually able to articulate how those scientific truth claims fit into their wider worldview, how much they trust them, what epistemic weight they attach to them, and does it or does it not dislodge what they know from revelation. And 100% of these students are more certain in the fundamental tenets of their theology, of their belief. There's just one testimony of over 400 testimonials we have that I just thought I'd share. University student who studies molecular biology saying, this is the most beneficial and easy to follow Aqidah course I've ever taken. The content was brilliant, presented in a beautiful manner. Instructor was engaging and approachable. Breaks and quizzes helped. I can go back to my molecular biology MSc and I won't be as lost as I used to be. So this is a little bit about the approach we take, what Roots Academy does, the pedagogical and the theological lens that we try to portray and that we try to train and develop students on. And with that, I come to the end of my presentation and happily welcome any questions. Thank you.
Excellent. Jazakallah khair, Hisham. A lot of positive comments in the chat, which you can read after, but I'll get to the questions for the sake of the recording. I'll ask them. Question from Dr. Farah. As STEM students, do you think they would benefit from some exposure to a humanities or arts approaches as well as exposure to traditional ulum?
Sorry, I was muted. Absolutely. And really what we are trying to do is expose them to, that epistemological foundation that we try and give them is something from the humanities, right? It's really a philosophical groundwork. It's lifting the hood of the scientific conclusion, the truth claim, and saying, look at all these philosophical assumptions sitting underneath. It isn't all just telescopes and microscopes. There are philosophical assumptions sitting underneath, and for a lot of them, that's shocking to realize that science is not just sensory information. It's not just empirical fact, but there's so much sitting underneath in terms of assumption and extrapolation, etc.
Excellent. There was a few comments from Dr. Paya, who seems to question your examples on what's probable and certain. Did you encounter any such examples in your classes?
Is it the point on certainty being a psychological?
Yeah.
It's not an epistemic property, but a psychological state. So to Pai's question, I agree. Certainty is not an epistemic property; it's a psychological state. However, the way we try to define them as kind of levels of certainty or levels of epistemic weight that you'd give to a particular truth claim. Would you give it the weight of being something that's true, something that's false, probably true, probably false? So although certainty is a psychological state and we use that for ease of understanding, what we're actually talking about is the probability of something being true, the probability of that truth claim being actually true, objectively true. So yeah, I agree with you, and apologies for the different terminology used. We sometimes use more familiar terminology to the students so that they're not kind of lost in jargon. In terms of the examples being easily challenged, you're right. A lot of these examples do get challenged in the classroom, and we do have interesting conversations around them. However, we do hold, theologically speaking, at least from the Ghazalian and the Taymiyyan school, classically, we do hold these kind of axioms to be, we do hold these as logical axioms, but we're certainly open for discussion. We'd love to learn more.
Another question, just skipping along, there's one from Center for Islamic Sciences asking, do you make use of first principles?
Yeah, so when we introduce reason as a source of truth, as an epistemic source, we actually introduce what are the kind of first principles, what are the first axioms of reason? So the idea of the part is less than the whole, the ideas that Paya above is kind of asking questions about. We kind of introduce those as logical axioms, as the first principles of reason. And we then utilize those first principles, as was done classically, to come to the conclusion of God's existence. So yes. We rely heavily on the works of Al-Ghazali and Ibn Taymiyyah and others.
Yeah, I think that was an extension of the question from Center for Islamic Sciences asked, do you use the works of scholars like Ibn Furak and Imam Ghazali and others?
Absolutely. But the idea, the whole trick is actually in the presentation and in the pedagogical approach we take in the lesson. There's so much to take from the classical tradition, but we lose a student in the first 10 minutes the moment we talk in Arabic. So it's really about being cognizant of the student and the audience. There's a question from Uzma about testimonials. I have an Excel sheet with about 400 and something testimonials. I'm very happy to share the raw document. There's quite a few. There's a lot of people who had left Islam and embraced Islam again. There's a lot of students who, there are new Muslims who embrace Islam due to these classes, like non-Muslims who would attend, and by the last lesson, they would take the Shahada. The number of Muslims who are kind of under the hood, suffering from intellectual doubts, is far more than we have people on the ground to counter. So the number of people who are finding solace in this course are quite a few, and from great work like Sheikh Hamza from Basira Education as well.
The question from Bella, I'm interested in what source of dilemma do university students come with in these classes? Are there any dilemmas you've not been able to reconcile?
Yeah, we, across the campuses, we do come across really interesting questions and let's say scientific truth claims, which are difficult to reconcile without knowing the specifics of, and requiring original scholarship. Whether it's looking at like the field of quantum physics, quantum mechanics. So we have some students who are doing their PhDs in quantum physics, and they come up with, really technical quantum physics phenomena that seem to contradict something that in Revelation. And that's where we need the expertise of scholarship actually to square that circle and to reconcile those interpretations. That's not something an instructor can do on the fly in the classroom. So we know our limitations as instructors as well. So that's, there are, I think, one of the most tricky ones, which is the most common, really the most common dilemma that always gets brought up, which is something that I'm always in debt to Dr. Shoaib for, is the question of evolution. That is the most common question that university students ask us, without an exception, on any campus across the country. And we're able to kind of provide Shoaib's summary of the way Muslim scholars have tackled, using the very same approach. How do they reconcile the two? How do they square the circle? And so that's kind of, but there's a lot of, I'd say, dilemmas in the world of physics. We need an Islam and quantum physics book from Shoaib next. I think that would be really good.
Maybe one last question, somebody asking about whether they can benefit, whether the rest of us can benefit from these courses. Is there an online presence?
So at the moment, we focus entirely on the on-site, but perhaps in the next maybe 18 to 24 months, you can expect there to be kind of an on-demand version online. Not in the next kind of 3 to 6 months, but yeah, perhaps Q1 of next year, first quarter of next year, inshallah, we should have something. And I'd be happy to share the link with Dr. Nadeem, Dr. Fella, Dr. Shoaib, and particularly Dr. Fella and Dr. Shoaib, I'm already indebted to. I mean, a lot of this has come from their advice and their support. Shoaib's asked a question of what's the biggest challenge you've come across when it comes to science? Perhaps I'll stop at that question. I think the biggest challenge when it comes to science is the biggest challenge we come across as instructors when talking to students, is that if you're not trained in the sciences, so I studied electrical engineering, I did A-level physics, etc. So it's perhaps easier for me. But when you're not trained in the empirical sciences, it's very hard on the fly to deal with students' questions with very specific phenomena. Someone's asking about multiverse theory. Someone's asking about the Big Bang. They want to know the answer now. They're not going to wait, and they don't have the patience for you to go look it up. So how do we deal when we don't know the specific? So we're giving them a generic framework, but the biggest challenge is how do we give them the specific answer to their specific question? Multiverse theory, evolution, etc., etc., etc. When we don't know the specific answers. Tawaqquf, like the idea of intellectual stoppage, is possible, but it's not the most convincing answer. So that's something that we really do struggle with. Yeah, Allah knows best.
Excellent. Hisham, if you don't mind, we'll stop here just to keep on time. But there are more comments in the chat, and as mentioned before, continue to engage with the group in the chat, inshallah. We